Përshëndetje për të gjithë. Jemi live nga zyrët e Open Data Kosovo për të filluar konferencën ndërkombëtare Got Data 2020. Për arsye që do të kemi edhe mysafir ndërkombëtar, e gjithë konferenca do të jetë në gjuhën angleze, mirë po vetëm desha të ju uroj mirëseardhje dhe të ju falenderoj shumë që jeni bashkëngjitur sot virtualisht në konferencën tonë për vitin 2020 në këtë format të cilin ndoshta nuk e kemi preferuar edhe ne, mirë po sidoqoftë kemi shpreh dëshirën që të fillojmë edhe ta mbajmë premtimin ose traditën e mbajtjes së konferencës. Andaj mirë se keni ardhur. Dear all, my name is Blirt Atachi and I'm the Executive Director of Open Data Kosovo. Together with my team here at Open Data Kosovo, it is our pleasure to virtually welcome you and thank you for joining us at our annual international conference, Got Data. Although we are very busy doing a lot of activities throughout the year, this conference is very important to us, and it's always something that brings us together in networking. It sparks inspiration, and it's a time to reflect on what we have done in the previous year and what we are looking ahead in the new one. Unfortunately, this year we had to improvise and still keep up the tradition of virtually organizing the edition of 2020. Anyways, I want to take the time to thank our partner, Ipanshpo Foundation from Poland, with whom we together started this annual conference 2 years ago. It was something that was sparked as an idea to bring all of our friends, all of our international friends that are in the civic tech world to Kosovo and inspire us with their interventions and also spark collaboration with best practices of open data around the world. This year, we also have the support of the municipality of Pristina for starting the conference, for which we are truly thankful to continue our successful collaboration and enhance open data initiatives throughout the years. We would like to take the time to invite our partner from Poland, which I briefly introduced, to say some words virtually, and I hope that you are doing fine and healthy. We are greeting you from Kosovo with all my team, which is behind the doors in the other room, joining with you all.
Thank you everyone in Kosovo and everyone who is watching and then listening to our conference. Unfortunately, we can't see each other in Pristina as usually, but I'm super sure that we're gonna see each other not longer than the very next year for the fourth, right? For the fourth, if we include this one. So for the fourth Got Data international conference, and I'm super happy that especially Open Data Kosovo is able to think about this format, which is a short but very full of content, and especially as the name of the conference, but also the name of our great partner in Western Balkans, so Open Data Kosovo, say that the data was a topic that was really important during the COVID-19, and I think I'm looking forward to listen to our speakers who are great, and kudos for having them with us, because I think it's a renaissance of data and open data as well. Unfortunately, we needed to have this pandemics, but I think it's visible to society, it's visible to decision makers that data is an important factor in bringing more transparency. But first of all, I think, and we would have some examples, I guess, also next year to see that it saves lives and it saves health. So once again, kudos to Open Data Kosovo, to municipality of Pristina, and I'm super happy just to transform myself into a listener now. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you so much. We are very happy to hear that you are well and healthy and excited to be with us today. So with further ado, I would like to open the conference and introduce you to a little bit of the theme that we got inspired for this year and what is ahead of us. 200 new cases. My city had the highest number of cases in the country. I think there are more cases today than yesterday, or aren't there? This type of scenario has been played out in our daily conversation since March 2020. The overwhelming dynamic and never before experienced nature of the pandemic, of course, that has increased the need for fast and easy access to data to help us really understand what is really happening. That's why this year edition of the conference is Openness During Shutdown and how COVID-19 exposed the need for fast and easy access to data. The implication of openness during shutdown are greater than just simply knowing how many cases are today. Being informed on the trends of the spreads, which areas are more infected, or the symptoms throughout these infections, amongst others, contribute and educate handling of this pandemic. Moreover, we experience also as Open Data Kosovo that this shutdown also exposed and initiated the need for a lot of digitalization of services where human touch is not needed, but also making use of already existing digital services that were in place because of this pandemic. So for today, we have prepared 2 online sessions with experienced professionals and pioneers in the field to understand how COVID-19 exposed the need for fast and easy access to data. In the first session, the state of open data with a focus on COVID-19 pandemic will explore the landscape surrounding open data and how it's constantly evolving for the need of fast and accessible data is becoming more and more apparent. This session will revolve around open data in a developed country such as the United Kingdom and cross-cutting sectors with data with a special focus on how actually COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the need for fast and easy access of data. We will have Tim Davies, the Director of Global Data Initiative, in talking more about their recent interventions, but also for the institution itself. In the session 2, of course, we will continue again with open data and COVID-19, how the emerging challenges were encountered from international open data charter. And we will have Natalia Corfi, which will tell us more how pandemic has changed the way how each institution works, and also how has possessed unforeseen obstacles to their work. The emerging challenges deriving from this will have, of course, major implication in many aspects in our lives. So this session will revolve around Open Data Charter's work, its project relating to COVID-19 pandemic, and how they overcome these emerging challenges. But before I start with these sessions, we at Open Data Kosovo has evaluated that it would be interesting to elaborate a little bit on the institutions that our speakers represent, and also our joint forces to bring in such best practices in Kosovo. So for this reason, we would like to briefly introduce you a little bit about Global Data Barometer and International Open Data Charter and their best practices and joint forces that we have worked throughout the years. To begin with, I would like to just say some few words about Global Data Barometer. It is an initiative that it's very new, but it sparked as a result of many research done within the Open Data Barometer, and now it will have a different perspective because of open data itself. It's also developing, even though we know that still it's a new concept and it's still exploring many ways of how it can improve our life and how it can also make our public institutions more efficient and more open and transparent to their communities. So Global Data Barometer started actually this year in 2019 in response to a demand expressed at the Open Government Partnership Summit. And the main inspiration was that they wanted to have more updated, in-depth country-level insights on data governance and availability. So through 2020, GDP consulted on the study design and building a broad community of the regional research hubs and thematic partners. We are very excited to share with you that during this year, Open Data Kosovo will be joining this initiative as a regional hub for Kosovo and Albania. And in this global report are currently more than 100 countries where Open Data Kosovo is excited to become part of this initiative. Our work, of course, will start in the following year and will generate data of more than 100 countries, leading to a new research-ready open data set, in-depth analysis, and country and sectoral profiles. We are building a long-term study, and this aim of the parameter on a sound footing for the next decade in order to consistently power policy and research data for the public good. So for all of you that it's the first time that you are encountering this initiative, we would like to say that it's a multilateral initiative whose goal is to publish data through their Open Data Barometer so that it encourages good governance, policy making, and open dialogue. So through this partnership that we have initiated this year, Open Data Kosovo will be able to monitor and publish the process of in-depth measurements, insights, and other metrics in regards to government responsibility on the publication and use of open data. So we hope that, like other initiatives that started in Kosovo, this initiative will also spark an inspiration and also will motivate our public institution to further improve with best practices on how to be a more open government. Furthermore, our plan will be supported by UNDP Kosovo, and we will be covering Kosovo and Albania. So stay tuned and feel free to contact us or join us in this new journey that we'll have for 2021. Furthermore, I would like to briefly also introduce International Open Data Charter that is going to be one of that is going to be in the next session, in the second session for this annual conference. And I would really like to highlight that Open Data Charter is a collaborative organization, is a collaborative initiative between governments and experts at a global level. And the same as Global Data Barometer, Open Data Charter started as an initiative within the Open Government Partnership, and they came together to make data as a major resource and strengthen the cooperation between public and private organizations to capture the benefits of open data. Since its start in 2015, 5 years ago, Open Data Charter brought together over 100 national and local governments and articulated the positive implication that open data has, their influence in policy, and supported governments around the world to shift their focus towards purpose-driven publication on open data. We are happy to say that our public institution and our government has already put in practice these principles that Open Data Charter has, which are like very important, which is data should be open by default. It would be timely and comprehensive, accessible and also usable, comparable and interoperable, and also would improve governance in general and citizen engagement because it's there and it's open, and also it will spark innovation and it will help the economy grow. We are happy to say that these principles are day by day being implemented with different initiatives in the public sector, but also from the private sector and non-for-profit organizations. I'm happy to continue the presentation by opening the floor for all of you participants that are here today with us to share that we would be happy for you in the meantime to be as collaborative as we can within the circumstances that we are handling this conference. For this purpose, we have created this document which will be shared for you to be able to access. And in the following minutes, we will be shortly inviting our first speaker and also present his work. But before I invite our first speaker, I would like to share the document with all of you participants to be able to type your questions, and which will be followed up by a question and answer session in the end of the presentation, and you will be able to directly ask our first speaker, Tim Davies from Global Data Barometer. So I will put the link in the chat, and you will hopefully be able to access it. But if not, my team, which is helping me here today, will be there for you. So feel free to add all of your questions regarding both sessions. And in the end, when the question and answer session will be open, you will be more. It will be easier for you to access it. I see that our very well respected first speaker is here with us, and I would like to invite him to start his presentation. But before I do that, I would just like to read his bio, because our audience is very new and maybe they hadn't had the chance to know more about his background, which is very, very interesting and exciting. He is a multi-stakeholder initiative of Global Data Barometer director, which has thematics of partners, governments and private sectors, and also civil society organizations. It is my pleasure to invite Tim Davies to start his presentation. Hi,
Wonderful.
Tim.
Well, hi, and thank you for inviting me to join you, and great to see so many of you here for these sessions. Could someone give me permission to share my screen? Because I've got some slides to kind of talk through as I share with you some of the work we've done on the State of Open Data project and the Global Data Barometer. So I am just going to now hopefully bring onto your screens that window, and I'm just going to make sure I can also still see some of you. So let me start off by introducing myself a little more and sharing a little more of the journey through open data I've been on, and you'll see a timeline here. There's lots of timelines in the State of Open Data project. It's a method of getting context I really enjoy. But I first encountered the world of open data a decade ago, writing a thesis on data.gov.uk, one of the second large government open data portals, and the communities around it, coming out of work on civic technology and participation. That led me into working on exploring the emerging impacts of open data in developing countries, a research network with IDRC, Canada's International Development Research Centre, looking at open data practices through case studies in 12 countries. But that gave rise, as part of that, we were doing qualitative work, but we recognised the need also to benchmark, compare and understand the differences between countries. And that led us to develop the first edition of the Open Data Barometer, a multi-country study. In that role as well at the Web Foundation, I started developing data standards, curious about how standards were shaping the way data is produced and used. So I was involved in authoring the Open Contracting Data Standard for public procurement transparency, a standard called 360 Giving, widely used in the UK for grants data, and more recently standards on beneficial ownership transparency. And that was really a way to explore how open data is not just about releasing existing data sets, but it's about creating these platforms and tools for mass collaboration, joining up across silos of data, introducing good practice through standardization, both in the way data is shared and the way it's measured. That led me into the world of social enterprise, co-founding a workers' cooperative called Open Data Services, where we recognize the need for backroom labor of open data and standardization, the recognition that it's not just about the shiny hackathons or apps, it's about the behind the scenes work to make data work sustainably, and that's a long-term challenge. Then in 2018, I worked on the book I'll be drawing on a lot here, The State of Open Data. I co-edited with three fantastic co-editors, a collaborative book looking back at a decade of open data practice across 16 different sectors, 7 regions, and 7 different stakeholder groups. And that was a real qualitative work, but doing that work highlighted to us the need to go back also to the more quantitative comparison, because it gave us lots of insights into what was happening in open data, but not a sense of how that was unfolding across the world. Were we seeing those cases being representative of what's going on everywhere, or outlier examples? So that brings me to current work and the role I'm speaking to you now from as founding director for the new Global Data Barometer study that I'll share a bit more about as we go on. So in this talk, I'm going to draw on the recent years of that timeline. I'm going to start by sharing with you some of the findings from the State of Open Data project. I'm then going to touch on viewing data through the lens of the current COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'm going to turn to the Barometer project and look at how we're planning to survey the future of what we term data for the public good as a broad concept to take in open data work, but also some of the other work going on around it. So to launch into the state of open data, and I think it was mentioned just before I started and joined, that really happy to answer questions on any of this. I believe there's a document for questions. I'm also happy to see questions in the chat or feedback or comments as I go through, as in this world of 2020 conferencing, it's often quite difficult to get that feedback from people as we work through. So I welcome any feedback as I go through, or questions, clarifications. But let me tell you then about the first part of this, the state of open data, histories and horizons. So as I mentioned, this was a book project. It was supported by the Open Data for Development Network, a global partnership working to create open data ecosystems for social change, government transparency, and supporting the global sustainable development goals. Within that OD4D network, we drew on a range of collaborators, both from that network and beyond. And the book itself was the product of over 60 authors and my co-editors' work, Steve Walker, Mor Rubenstein, and Fernando Perini. And the project really emerged from a recognition that the open data movement had grown a lot since 2009-10, when these ideas of opening data were first breaking onto the global stage. And we identified that to understand open data today, we needed deep dive into the experience of different sectors and regions and stakeholders, and to understand some of the cross-cutting issues shaping this field. So we commissioned original chapters from expert authors to bring together their own reflections, but also try and capture what's going on across the world. So we had a collaborative process for that project. We started with these environment scans. I think some people here may have contributed to those open Google Docs where we said, this is what we think are the issues in a given field. We had community input, drafting a peer review process, and then it resulted in a fairly weighty book, of which copies are still available in print, but it's also all open access online as a resource to as individual chapters and the whole text. And in the book, we used 5 lenses to explore the evolution of the open data movement: historical, regional, sectoral, cross-cutting issues, and different stakeholders. And I'm going to start with the historical and then go backwards through those themes, just to draw out some of the key findings, because I think understanding the history of where we've come from in work on open data is really important to charting our future. So when we looked at a decade of open data work, we looked at the International Open Data Conference and the themes that have been discussed there, and presented a broad brush history. It was a history that starts in 2010 with a lot of focus of people on building portals and publishing data sets. Data.gov.uk, data.gov, data.gov in Kenya, each country setting up their portals and platforms and competing really for the number of data sets that they could publish. By 2012, there was an increasing focus on impact, questions about what impact is this having. But that was very much light touch impact evaluation. By 2015, there was a recognition that we needed to look at open data in context in particular sectors. So the 2015 International Open Data Conference had a lot of tracks on particular thematic areas where data was being used, and really starting to see this fusion between an open data community who maybe came out of open source worlds or worlds focusing on right to information and focusing on data in and of itself, to a real connection between thematic sectoral communities and the open data world. By 2016, the importance of local action was coming in much more strongly. The recognition that we need global goals, but to secure local action and impact. And by 2018, many more critical questions were being asked about what's happening with open data. In Buenos Aires, the International Open Data Conference there had these new themes on the agenda of how open data and artificial intelligence agendas interact, whether we're talking enough about data infrastructures, and increasingly a sense that the spirit of openness, the optimism about what open could do, and some of the questions that were now being asked much more strongly about privacy issues or inappropriate sharing of data meant that open data was under threat. No longer was open by default as simple a phrase as it maybe was around the time when projects like the Open Data Charter were initially launched. And we've seen a real evolution through that time. So I think seeing that broad shift, each country though has gone through that in different ways, different rates and paces. And that led to what in the book we talk about as an open data identity crisis, a real challenge as open data entered into its difficult teenage years, years that we're just entering now. So for example, we've seen open data in many ways move from the margins into the mainstream. There are policies and practices in many countries. There are professionals working on this. There are companies and firms. But we've also seen questions of whether there is one open data movement or many. How much is there a shared interest uniting open data practice, or how diffuse and diverse is it? We've had to confront the dark sides of data, whether that's from the Snowden revelations in earlier in the decade to more recent concerns about misinformation, electoral interference, AI, abuses of data, a recognition that data is not in and of itself universally positive. It can be used in very negative ways as well as positive, and open data movements need to engage with that. And there's been this move from open data activists being outside agitators pushing for government or other sectors to work better, to often being insider architects being hired into the state, but maybe given roles and remits that take them away from those open data roots. And this all led in the book to a question of whether open data was last decade's debate, a movement that had peaked and was waning, or whether open data can become embedded as a golden thread of data policy, something that is central to the way we approach any work on data in future. So those were the big questions posed in the book, and to some extent, a number of those are unanswered, and maybe there'll be questions that resonate with work that you do. But we sought then to see how these were playing out in those regions, themes, and stakeholder groups. So I'm just going to briefly share with you in reverse order some of the highlight messages from the book. So the last section in the book looks at different regions in the world, and we find, and Barometer projects also show, that there are open data activities in every region of the world right now, yet they can take quite different character in each region. So for example, in the Middle East and North Africa, open data efforts are commonly framed within a wider agenda of data-driven innovation, whereas our authors writing on Eastern Europe and Central Asia talked about the younger NGOs operating within an accountability and anti-corruption framework who were the key vector to popularize open data. And you can see some of the other framings here on the slide, which reflect both regional differences and differences of timing. The point at which open data ideas entered into regional discourse has also had a significant impact on the policy agendas it's become linked to. And I think the same is reflected at the national level within regions. So it's really interesting when understanding how countries respond to the idea of open data is to look at when did it first become a policy agenda in the country? Was it linked to political crises that led to a focus on accountability? Was it linked to basic data campaigns that were all about fixing the plumbing of the data system, as maybe in the Danish experience? Or is it something that's been linked to the rise of artificial intelligence strategies in countries? And just for everyone, yes, the book, there's a question here. It is the State of Open Data Histories and Horizons, and I'll put a link on a future slide to where you can download and access copies of the book. Working backwards again through the sections, the second to last section explores how different stakeholders engage with open data. So in a chapter on donors and investors, Fernando Perini and Michael Jarvis produced this map that you can see on the slide of who's been funding different sectors of work. So the blue dots are particular thematic areas, the yellow dots are funders, and it's a force-directed graph that tries to show who's connected to which settings. And you can see some fairly central groups like the World Bank, the International Development Centre, Research Centre and Midian Network playing a role in resourcing a number of different open data communities while trying to connect knowledge between these different spaces. But you'll also see specific funders out on the margins of this, maybe funding work in a particular region or funding work in a particular sector. And one of the challenges ahead is to grow that support for open data and sustainable action on thematic specific open data activities. And that really is one of the big questions funders, I think, are still facing. Certainly it was something in 2019 when we launched the report that was central to the questions funders were asking, which is how to move from looking at open data as a standalone area of investment, a kind of bolt-on program, to considering open data and data issues within all the other thematic programming that donors have, whether that's work on anti-corruption, gender equity, development assistance, or extractives, or any of the other themes here on the slide. And that really is a challenge we also see for the large multilaterals, the development banks and others, which Craig Hammer in his chapter found that even when multilaterals are supporting the creation of new data infrastructures, for example, in many countries, land registers or corporate registers are donor funded, there often aren't mandates to require that non-personal information from those systems is made available as open data. In other words, much multilateral funding funds large proprietary silos of data still, rather than open and joined up data infrastructures. So different stakeholder groups are really grappling with different challenges as we head into open data's second decade. For the private sector, Stefan, Joel, and Carla Benina in their chapter identify a lack of support for small and medium enterprise to make the most of the opportunities to be users, intermediaries, or providers of data. And they explore how the language around data collaboratives could create a space for more engagement. For journalism, the problem of funding investigative data-driven reporting remains largely unresolved in many parts of the world. And for governments, there's a real challenge to balance the institutionalization and governance of data with avoiding recreating the kinds of gatekeeping and control of data that open data reacted to in the first place. So let me go next to some of the cross-cutting issues in the book, and I'll just touch on these very briefly. Firstly, the book really highlights that a lack of investment in data literacy remains a big block to securing the best impacts from open data across many sectors. And we find in the work for that chapter that we have a very poor picture worldwide of what's going on with data literacy capacity building. We know about some examples of school of data type courses and ultimately relatively small initiatives. But I think in the book we find it's hard to find evidence of more than maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of trainings delivered on open data, which is a drop in the ocean when we consider how many people could use and benefit from open approaches to working with data. That section of the book also touches on privacy, the need to think about how data infrastructures might host both open and non-open data in future, calling for the open data movement to tread a tricky line, recognizing that open by default doesn't mean always open. And also a challenge raised by artificial intelligence, where we argue, and in the chapter I wrote in there, we argue that instead of seeing open data as a raw material to train AI systems, we need to understand open data approaches as offering an alternative to the centralizing power structures of machine learning. With attention paid to data literacy, inclusion, and standards, the chapter argues, open data can support small-scale solutions that empower communities in collective problem solving, rather than imagining we can successfully number crunch and impose policy from above. So there's lots more there in that chapter, including in that section, including work on measurement, gender equity, and indigenous data sovereignty that I don't have time to summarize now, but I really encourage people to dig into. So lastly, in the book, we have our sectoral chapters, which is the biggest section in the book. And I really can't offer you any sort of comprehensive synthesis, but I do want to dip into a few themes because they pick up in the Global Data Barometer. Firstly, we find there are very different levels of open data maturity across the different sectors we look at, whether that's agriculture, extractives, environment, education, land ownership. In some, there's a real nuanced idea of open by default that's embedded. In others, perhaps government finance, there have been early prototypes and innovations in using open data, but haven't translated into sustainable standards and data infrastructures. And it's become clear that we've been imagining not only the opening up of existing data, but we've actually been working on the creation of powerful new transparency regimes, not always recognizing quite what a big challenge that is. So across all these sectors, there's a need to understand what's really going on and whether the bright spots from one country or another are scaling up and being shared globally. And that's something the Global Data Barometer really seeks to do, and I'll come back to that. However, that's been a race through a 400-page book and some of the themes in there. I was asked, and the name of it again, it's The State of Open Data. It's on the slide now, and it's available at stateofopendata.od4d.net as an open access resource. And I think we still have copies for kind of academic libraries. If anyone's interested, please do reach out to me on that, because we're keen to make sure that the work that was put in by the 60+ authors and many reviewers really can carry forwards. But I was asked in this talk to also look at open data through the lens of the current pandemic. And that book was written in 2018 and published last year. But obviously 2020 has really changed many things. So I want to just share some thoughts on open data and COVID-19, or what we're learning from this period. And I should caveat, this section of the talk is based on my observations rather than in-depth research. So inevitably we'll have some UK bias in it, which is where I'm based. It's not as global or comprehensive a look as hopefully the other sections are. But as a starting point for this, I want to draw on Lee Dodds and Peter Wells' chapter in The State of Open Data on open data as infrastructure. In that, they outline how we should understand data by analogy to physical infrastructure by road and rail, which helps us understand all the components that make up data practices today. And just as physical infrastructure and the capacity of governments and the private sector to maintain it vary across the world, access to high quality data infrastructure is also unequally distributed. And that leaves some countries much less able to secure the benefits of what data can bring. There are essential building blocks of data infrastructure: standards, identifiers, registers, but they've been underinvested in and have had limited adoption over recent years. And Lee and Peter also highlight that future data infrastructures need to have this mixed approach to open data and more restricted data sets that can build trust and openness into our data infrastructure alongside each other, respecting privacy and making things as open as they can be. Now, this idea of infrastructure, I think, is helpful to see what's been going on with data during the pandemic. And to this, I think we can add one other key founding insight from the discipline of information infrastructure studies, and that is that infrastructures only really become visible upon breakdown. And I'd argue that opening also reveals aspects of infrastructures that were already broken, or at least from the perspective of new users and uses. And the pandemic has really pushed many of our data infrastructures and practices to breaking point. And it's revealed how the data practices of the last decade could be deployed for the public good. So we need to think about how much our data infrastructures are functioning as we need and what open data can tell us about their future. So I'm going to focus more on regulatory and government data infrastructures and on scientific data sharing infrastructures or research data sharing, because that's the area I know better. And up on screen here now is the Johns Hopkins global dashboard of coronavirus data. You know, this could be the most COVID specific data we can look at, case numbers around the world, very stark information presented in a simple dashboard, yet telling a deeply harrowing story in many ways about how we've responded to this crisis. And if we look behind that dashboard on the GitHub pages for the project, we reveal hundreds of sources, including on the side there a JSON file from Kosovo. All these sources, open data feeding into that global dashboard. Distributed labor, a distributed data infrastructure that's resulting from the publication of data using common file formats, GIS systems, and other platforms that would have been hard to imagine a decade ago. This has really demonstrated how our open data practices have worked well in many ways, building this sharing very rapidly. And it's demonstrated the demand for data and the wide range of actors, not always governments, involved in compiling and sharing it. But at the same time, in removing the friction from the exchange of aggregate data, we've revealed a number of challenges. Firstly, while the envelope for the data, the CSV files or the JSON files, might be increasingly standardized, the contents of the data is not. Different testing regimes or different methods for determining what counts as a COVID-19 fatality can mean misleading conclusions are drawn from cross-country comparisons. Stats and statistics are flying around, but the context and stories behind them are not always adequately captured and shared. We need much more work on structuring the context and sharing that, and understanding where data is not commensurable one data set with another. And while aggregate data might be flowing faster, these headline numbers, it often remains very hard to get disaggregated data to the places where it's needed. For example, in the UK earlier this year, local governments were waiting weeks to receive details of positive COVID tests in their area, frustrating their efforts to develop local strategies or to support localized contact tracing, and largely because the systems for managing this data were simply not sophisticated enough. And we've also revealed creaking processes of data management in other places. Again, from the UK context, in October, we discovered a whopping 15,000 positive COVID tests had been missed from total figures and from contact tracing systems because data files were being exchanged in a 1987 version of the Excel file format, which had a hard limit of 65,000 rows on how many test results could be presented. And without adequate error checking in place, with this sort of old-fashioned spreadsheet email back and forth approach, data was lost and chances to trace contacts and address viral spread were missed. And as we more tightly integrate our data flows into all sorts of decision-making systems, this underinvestment in data quality and data management becomes an ever more pressing issue. Furthermore, looking at COVID case data and hopefully in future vaccination data calls on us to think critically about the ways in which data is politicized. Early open data advocacy often tacitly assumed that data was in some ways apolitical. And yet, if we draw on the work of people like Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio on data feminism, the work of the Civic Foundation on structured context, it highlights for us that our practices need to examine and rethink the power relationships that are embedded in data and in how it's used. For example, data during this pandemic can be used to hold the powerful to account, to put in place the policies that will protect and safeguard the most vulnerable. Or data can be used to put pressure and responsibility onto individual citizens, holding individuals responsible for their actions, but giving up the responsibility that collectively we have states to work on, or communities to work on. And we've also seen cases where the politicization of data results in governments trying to clamp down on detail being shared. For example, earlier this month, there were reports of raids on the home of a former Florida state employee who had continued to publish detailed COVID statistics even after being fired, allegedly resisting political efforts to censor the COVID rates being published in the state. And this demonstrates a couple of things. It demonstrates how much governments are seeking to control data, but it also points to the power of a public data culture and how much our public data infrastructure relies upon the professional ethics and personal dedication of individual officials and volunteers. And that very much chimes with the State of Open Data chapters that pointed to the continued reliance of open data practices on individual champions, and that raised questions about how far open data is truly being institutionalized in either legislation or in inviolable bureaucratic norms. For other examples of where there are fights over how pandemic-related data should be shared, we can look at the open letter coordinated by open data pioneer Beth Novak that calls for vaccine trial and approval data to be fully published. And we can look at recent controversy over the sharing of vaccine price information. There are numerous cases in this pandemic to see how our data infrastructures are surviving and where they're breaking down. But crucially, it's not just health data infrastructures this highlights, it's all the other things around it. For example, public finance and procurement data. Early in the pandemic, the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency convened experts to come up with a guide to the kinds of data needed to maintain the transparency of public finances, including information on emergency funds, subsidies, grants and support, and information on public procurement. And you only need to look at the Open Contracting Partnerships weekly newsletter of procurement data-driven media stories that's uncovering corrupt or inefficient procurement processes around PPE, ventilators, and perhaps soon vaccines to see the importance of public data, but also the problems. And if you don't subscribe to some of the OCP's newsletters on this, really encourage you to. I'll put some links in the chat or share those later on. Because data has allowed the New York Times to uncover £11 billion of questionable spending on personal protective equipment to politically connected companies in the UK. And while the data has allowed us to do that, court challenges to question that and call for accountability look set to meet significant hurdles. It reminds us all too readily that data and information alone don't end impunity or solve tricky problems. It's only one part of the solution. And we've also seen many cases of data published extremely late, with contracts data only published on national procurement portals months after contracts were awarded or even completed. If data doesn't reflect the reality, it's hard for us to investigate and even start that accountability chain. Now, in the UK experience, again, there's a recent procurement green paper that picks up on this problem, a policy paper. It recognises that to date, the publication of procurement data has been supported only by administrative policy rather than being rooted in law. And that starts to take me on to the GDB, where understanding the kind of footing that data infrastructure is on is central to thinking about the next decade of data ahead. It's not enough to know, is a data set published today? We need to know, will it be published, maintained, quality assured into the future? Because it's only then that accountability can be truly built upon it in a sustained way, that businesses can be built upon it, and that it can be integrated into other governmental systems or governance systems, helping break through silos of data. And it is worth noting, though, that even where there are legal mandates for data collection, many governments either relaxed those requirements during the pandemic or have lacked the capacity to maintain the collection of reliable ongoing data sets. Right now, it's too early to tell exactly how much data collection has been undermined by the pandemic and how far governments have used the pandemic as an excuse not to publish certain data sets. But again, that's something we'll be looking at through the Global Data Barometer. So let me tell you a bit more about this project and in maybe the last sort of 5 or 6 minutes, and then get to questions and discussion. I really hope we can have a discussion rather than just a Q&A. So along with a fantastic network of partners and colleagues, I've been spending most of 2020 on the development of this new study that explores open data within the wider data landscape, and that will provide a baseline and tracking of how data policy and practice are unfolding across the world over the next 10 to 15 years, certainly up to 2030 and the SDG targets. It is a study that, like previous open data barometers, will result in an overall index ranking country performance on data for the public good. But it seeks to be much more than that. It seeks to be a foundation for critical research and a tool for a wide range of data initiatives to help understand their starting points, their progress, and the next steps needed to lock in the kind of good data practices that mean we can build a sustainable, open, collaborative future for how data shapes our world. So it seems almost unimaginable to show this photo of a group of people gathering together internationally. I hope it won't be too long before we're able to do this kind of thing again. But back in January this year, in Washington, DC, I brought together a community of experts to start designing the study. And in that, we refined our focus on this core concept of data for the public good. And in thinking about data for the public good, we recognize that we can't just look at how data sets are available and whether they're openly licensed, but we need to also understand whether the data that is available is well governed, with public interest put before private profit. And that might mean having robust privacy protections, legislative guarantees of public data collection and quality, and a commitment to both sharing and opening data. And it's not enough just to count the data sets. When I went in that history of the state of open data, early on, there was a lot of competition between countries. Who's got the most data sets published? Well, it's not the count and the number that matters, it's which data. And so when we consider which countries are prioritizing data for the public good, we need to ask about whether they're investing in key data infrastructures to support healthcare, education, accountability, and climate action, to name just a few areas that we take. We draw very heavily on the Sustainable Development Goals as a global agreement on the public good, but we also seek to, in the design of the study, accept that each country defines a collective public good through its own democratic and civic processes, and we need to be responsive to that, not seeking to impose one model of data from above, but to pick up on the kinds of practices we already have global norms around and the goals we've already globally agreed to pursue. And in doing that, we have this governance component you've just seen, but we also have a component on capability, because to understand whether a country can use data for the public good, it needs a broad-based capacity to create, share, and use data. And that's not just government capacity, it's a balance of capacity and capability across different sectors: academia, civil society, journalists, business, other stakeholder groups, all needing capability to check and balance each other, and to recognize that the use of open forms of data is a project of mass collaboration. And then within the study, we look very much at data availability. Is there data available to serve key use cases? Is the data fit for purpose? How far is data being reshaped as it's open to recognize the far wider range of users and user needs it must meet? It's a pretty crucial part. As I said earlier, as data is opened, we realize where it's broken, where the rough edges are, where it could join up with another system, but doesn't, because the original creator's never seen that need. Out of the Emerging Impacts of Open Data in Developing Countries program a number of years ago, one of the crucial findings from that study was the upstream impact of opening data. The fact that opening data encourages a rethinking of the data sets held inside the state to recognize that they're used by a much wider range of users. And so when we look at data availability, we need to look at the shape of the data as well as its presence, and to also track where we're seeing a backsliding from openness, to look at where governments are substituting data sharing with a limited number of other stakeholders, often private firms, for more open sharing that can also involve civil society. And we need to really understand the cases where this is leading to the effective privatization of data rather than supporting the creation of robust data commons, which is one of the possible paths ahead of us now. And lastly, we need to dig into how data is being used in practice. And in this, we've been developing some new methods that follow the Open Data Charter's model of publish with purpose, to map out some of the common purposes to which certain kinds of data may be used, and to ask whether there's evidence of these kind of uses at play in different countries. So all that comes together in this rather large conceptual model for the study, where we're looking at a number of overarching themes. We have our core concept of data for the public good, and 4 pillars where we're seeking to collect indicator data on many different countries. For each of those pillars, we're looking at a range of sectoral themes. And last week, we were really pleased to publish the first consultation document on one of our thematic modules, the political integrity module that was developed in partnership with Transparency International and the Open Government Partnership. And we would really welcome input and feedback on this between now and the 15th of January. It outlines how we've conceptualized political integrity, the 5 different forms of data we're looking at, and how we're going to look at how well those data sets are governed, the rules for their production, and how we're going to look at their availability, what features good quality data will have. And we're going to be producing a number of these documents over the next 2 months as we finalize the design of the study. These are some of the thematic areas on screen that we're looking at. And we're really fortunate in doing this to be working with a range of expert partner organizations, but we're also keen to reach out much wider to make sure we're practicing what we preach, to make sure that the data we gather is as useful to as many different stakeholders as possible, as we have this opportunity to put a survey into the field. Our methodology uses an expert survey where we have country experts in over 100 countries who'll be responding to a structured survey with a review of answers to try and get as rigorous as we can quantitative and qualitative assessment of how countries are data practices and policies are evolving. And we're doing that work through a network of regional hubs. I'm really delighted to be here with Open Data Kosovo, who are one of our regional partners in the project and a great support to the work we're going to be doing. And so by the end of 2021, this network of partners will have helped us collect data in well over 100 countries so that we can publish detailed indicator data and analysis to understand that future state of open data and data practice. So it's all very well for me to explain how we're tracking data, but what do we expect to find and what does it mean for the future? Well, last remarks from me now. As the State of Open Data concluded, and there's a quote here on screen, open data or data itself is central to addressing many of the big development challenges ahead of us, and it's certainly proving central to addressing the current global crisis we face in this pandemic. But we can't assume that openness will be the default approach for people addressing these problems. There are, far fewer, a decade ago, far fewer public officials or civil society organizations were thinking about the role of data as a tool of governments. Open data movements helped to change that in many parts of the world. But at the same time, the distributed, decentralized, bottom-up, collaborative open data approaches that were developed are now competing with centralized, buzzword-compliant, AI-adorned, commercially packaged solutions that seek to address narrow problems and bypass the generativity, the accountability, and the positive externalities possible through open data approaches. In other words, open data did not necessarily win the battle for what the future should look like. We still have many much more closed approaches being offered to governments and often simpler to take off the shelf and use. So this calls for those working with an open data ethic to move from working on niche and purist projects to take the lead in the development of open and shared data infrastructures for the future that can join the dots between different problem spaces, to see open data as part of the wider landscape without giving up on its specific potentials. And that's what the Global Data Barometer is all about. The pandemic has shown us the importance and the limitations of data, and it's shown the vast challenges of building data infrastructures that can meet the needs of our public health emergency. challenges that are mirrored when it comes to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals or averting climate crisis, issues we can't be taking our eye off either. And the choice is quite stark that ahead of us. We can allow these problems to be solved through privatized and proprietary data. We can pursue the open approaches that support a collaborative mode of response. That involves a humanist approach to data. It involves a feminist approach to data. And it involves ongoing labor with no quick fixes or shortcuts. And I'm really looking forward in the GDB project to being inspired by the ways in which many diverse communities around the world have been and will continue to rise to these challenges. So thank you for letting me share that with you this morning or this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for walking us through your journey and your great experience in different institutions related to open data. We have questions from all of your presentations, starting from your book and your journey and everything in between. I'm going to share my screen in order to capture some of the questions. In respecting the time frame that we have for the conference, maybe we can combine some of the questions, or you can answer also them later. But yeah, we have interesting questions here.
Yes, I've got the Google Doc in front of me as well, and thank you everyone for these questions. I'm happy to put some replies in the document as well. Do you want to pick question you want me to address, or do you want me just to pick on some?
I mean, feel free. I mean, we can start maybe from some of your earlier presentation and building up to our latest collaboration within the GDP.
Yeah, so maybe just picking on the third question here, talking about the balance between privacy, transparency, and openness, and this kind of issue. I think the privacy chapter in the State of Open Data looks at this really well. And I think there have often been conflicts in the past between privacy and open data communities at a surface level, because at a surface level, there's some people saying we shouldn't share things and other people saying we should. Yet when you peel back one layer, you find there's a lot more in common. And in fact, it's often the same activists involved in both spaces, because it involves a recognition of the power of data. And so Sunil Abraham has a kind of famous quote, or very widely used quote that I think helps here, which is, transparency should be inversely proportional to power. If you have power, the cost of that power is things about what you're doing should be more transparent. If you are vulnerable, then your privacy is a form of protection for you. And so I think there are ways that integrate and understand privacy concerns and transparency concerns together, and increasingly sophisticated ways of navigating that balance. I think one of the things that is important to navigating that, and again, the privacy chapter in State of Open Data picks up on this, is the Open Data Institute's work on the data spectrum. So early work in the open data world very much had this binary, like it's open or it's not. Whereas I think we need to recognize there is a spectrum between fully open data that can be shared anywhere, shared data which is shared with a limited number of people or with extra governance around it, and closed data that shouldn't be shared. So I think at the conceptual level, there's reasonably good resolution. But what it highlights is every individual field and sector needs to go through that negotiation. So the one I know best is beneficial ownership transparency, the idea we should be able to know the identities of the people who ultimately own and benefit from companies. And we've done a lot of work in open ownership. I'll put links to this as well into the document. Have done a lot of work on navigating whether this highly personal data, the name and identity of someone who owns a company, should be public or not. And the argument that comes to is, yes, it should. It's a social contract. If you own a firm and have limited liability as a result of owning that firm, that's a public act. So your identity can be public, even though it falls within the definition of personal data. It can be public data at the same time. On the other hand, the name of the person who received a social security payment, even though that's government finance data, you know, it's a transaction from government to an individual, that individual is not getting the same sort of benefit of corporate shielding and limited liability. So their identity should not be public, their name shouldn't be in the data set. So the principle's resolved, but it needs negotiating in each individual case, and it needs us to be carefully thinking about that ourselves. Let's pick on any other. Does anyone want to, do you want to highlight one of these other questions to me? I'm just trying to read them off my screen.
I mean, I can also invite the person that asked the question to unmute themselves and also, you know, just have
that would be great, yeah.
Direction. Would anyone of you would like to open their mic and just ask the question directly, just to open the discussion? Or I can also read it, but I just wanted to make some interaction between our guests today, so it feels more connected to the audience. They're all digitally savvy. They just want to. Okay, so I'm not sure. I mean, you mentioned the book. We can share later the book and the link to subscribe to the newsletter, but maybe I'm not sure.
So I'm curious, someone's put a question about the first question here, how well current open government data infrastructures cope with updates to original data sets. I'd love to hear more about the background to that question and then maybe riff on that together.
Okay.
What question was that? And are you happy to unmute and just say a bit more about your question?
Or maybe we can go to the fourth question. Maybe you can share some recommendations on how governments can prioritize which data to make available first.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
So yes, let's explore that. So in the Global Data Barometer, what we're doing to help prioritize at least the data we measure is we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, the grand challenges we face, and identifying the kinds of data that help address those challenges. The Open Data Charter, in fact, I think Natty's speaking shortly, have done some work on open up guides that take particular sectors. And I worked on the anti-corruption open up guide and a little on the agriculture guide that take a sector. And then within that have identified like critical data sets that are really helpful, have identified use cases, and particularly that act as infrastructure that help unlock the value of other data. So one of the ways to kind of prioritize is to look at those existing guides or the method they followed, which was to map out the problems, start from the problems, identify the data, and then focus on the ones that will unlock the most value. I think in that, really, really crucial is thinking about who's in the room when you do that prioritization. So in the UK experience, we had a period of open data activity that involved a lot of user groups, a lot of community consultation between government departments and other stakeholders. But some of those became very, I think, corporate heavy. And so they focused only on the data that was of economic value rather than social value as well. So I think thinking about who's in the room when you have those conversations can really matter. And I'd also point to the work of the Centre for Open Data Enterprise, who do open data roundtables, where they have a methodology to prioritize, which involves some survey work, some mapping work, and then really getting people around the table, the government officials, the users of data. And I think that can't be overstated how useful, if you have the opportunity to that, it can be, because one of the things open data approaches, the collaborative side of it can unlock is connecting all those people inside institutions who've been generating and maintaining data for years, but feeling somewhat disconnected from their users, like having that opportunity to connect to the users can be greatly motivating, as well as impactful on what then gets released.
I would like to go back to another question, which is related to your theme for your today's session. And I would like to go with question 8. Do you think that open data can be used as a tool to combat the misconception regarding whether the virus is real, or about, you know, the vaccine in general now that it's very recent? Yeah.
Good question. So I think it's not, the biggest thing is the practice of challenging misinformation and doing that well. So I think we've seen a lot of fact-checking kind of projects emerge around the world, a lot of attempts to, in a sense, fight data with data, or fight misinformation with information, and that is important. But there are a number of different challenges we need to think about. One, we need to make sure we've got the resources to do that well. So the role of academics has changed in a world where much more data is available and they no longer have the monopoly on interpreting that data. The role of the media has changed, where the media no longer has the monopoly on interpreting and visualizing and sharing data. And I think we need a lot of critical reflection on not just producing more content, but really thinking about how our existing institutions are building trust in trustworthy data. That's not a tremendously good reply because it's not an area I'm particularly expert in, and I think there's a lot more in-depth work that's been done on how you challenge misinformation. But I think it's not always the case that more data leads to a more informed public, and we need to really think about that carefully.
Thank you so much. It's a very challenging topic. I mean, not just for this, but also for other misconceptions in general. We're struggling. Would you like to answer to any other questions we have here?
Yes.
Or, I mean, I can still invite anyone that can also open the discussion again.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Afina. Hi, Tim. So I've been listening to your presentation, and actually I just have this kind of simple question, but it's somehow very much, you know, asked to us, what is like this relationship between open data and big data? This is something that we always, you know, we encounter during any discussions that we have, even with the public officials or with the, you know, just civil society organizations. And just if you can somehow mention like 2-3 sentences and describe like that there is a correlation between these two, but actually this is something, you know, different. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So and I thought it was a really good question there. At the simplest level, obviously, big data is large data sets that we use, often statistical or now increasingly machine learning approaches to draw conclusions from. Open data is about who has access to do anything with the data. And I think there are some interesting relationships to unpack. Firstly, big data sets can be open, but that doesn't make them easy to use for the outsider, because they often involve a cost of, you know, systems or data management platforms to use. So there's a far smaller pool of people who can use an open big data set than can use general open data sets or small data sets. Big data is also more likely to have privacy concerns around it if it's anything to do with traces of human activity. And so often it will fall into the shared data part of the data spectrum rather than the fully open part of the data spectrum. And I guess for me, and I draw this out in the AI chapter of the State of Open Data, there is this tension between big data, I think, has often a centralizing ethic to it, a model of the panopticon vision of top-down algorithms to conclude things and direct what happens. Whereas I'd argue that open data can have a much more decentralized bottom-up ethic and culture to it. And so one of the things when talking with officials or others to explore is not so much the technologies they're engaging with, but the cultures around them, the people around them, and how well that aligns with their vision of what public service and public interest technology should be. Because big data can often sell, there are many good big data solutions. I'm not down on big data. I think there are lots of things that can be done with large data sets that are super exciting, particularly healthcare applications and others. But I think when you take that zoomed out to 1,000-foot view through big data, you miss the subtleties and nuances that make up social life. When you empower people at the community level to use data, it's much harder to control. It's much messier, but it's much more human. And I think that's where I touch on this idea of a humanist approach to data, a feminist approach to data needs to kind of challenge often the big data vision or that commercial big data vision.
Thank you so much. With respecting the time of the agenda, we can go on forever with the questions, but we would really like to thank you for your time and your presentation. We're really happy to have you here today, but also looking forward to our collaboration within the Global Data Barometer. So I would also like all the participants to continue looking at the document, because we can add the answers later, because we want to respect all of your time. And thank you once again, Tim. All the best to you, and happy holidays.
It's a real pleasure to join you all, and I'll certainly put some more notes in the document, and very much looking forward to continued work with Open Data Kosovo team in 2021. So happy holidays to you too.
Thank you so much. For all of you that have joined later, I would like to remind you that we have a second session at 2 p.m. With our next speaker from International Open Data Charter, which is Natalie Corfid, is the Deputy Director, and will talk more on open data and COVID-19 and how they overcame these emerging challenges. So you can join in the same link at 2 p.m. and also use the same document if you want to further add any questions that you want to directly ask Natalie. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we look forward to meet you once again later today. So have a great lunch break and see you soon.